All right, guys, so this is your economic apocalypse update, and things are just spiraling out of control. We now have confirmation. We have said that the West will decouple from China, and there's no going back. For many months, Yellen has been telling Europe to join the US, join their China crackdown, and punish Chinese companies for their overcapacity, which is a code word for industrial dominance. We know this is crazy. Europe's industries are already collapsing. GDP growth is well below 1%, and they are fighting a war against Russia. The last thing you need to do is anger China, one of your biggest trading partners, but they did. The EU has confirmed there are punishments for Beijing. They will impose brutal tariffs of up to 45% on Chinese EVs, and these import taxes will last for 5 years. In other words, the Eurozone is trying to cut off Chinese EVs into the bloc. And this is what happens when you can't compete anymore. What do? You simply close off the competition. This isn't a smart idea. It will just cause Europe's automakers to stagnate. Punishing China doesn't solve its energy crisis. Supply chains in Europe are also in shambles as well. Now, not all EU members agree with von der Leyen. The biggest economy in Europe, which is Germany, actually voted against the tariffs on China. Other big players like Spain also abstained. But they were drowned out by the Baltic states like Estonia, France, and Italy, which also wanted the tariffs. And this shows you how broken the entire EU system is. Nearly 20% of Germany's GDP comes from manufacturing, and they are already in a fast decline. But they have to comply and punish China because the majority of the EU voted for it. This is crazy because now their entire trade relations with China is in jeopardy. The EU is not like the US, which can print endless amounts of money. The US can handle a degree of protectionism because they have the US dollar, the world reserve currency, but Europe can't afford it. We just need to look at Europe's energy dependence. In 2022, when the G7 cut away Russian gas, global energy prices rose as well, but Europe's prices went up by 53% versus 2020. Prices in the US rose by only 27% during the same period. In the EU, power was nearly $250 per megawatt hour. In the US, it was 3 times cheaper. It's obvious who was the big loser of the energy sanctions on Russia. It's no surprise why manufacturing companies like Volkswagen have resorted some production to the US. And now the EU has followed the US into yet another economic trap. This is going to backfire very badly on Europe's economy. Now, if you're China, you have to assume a few things: that the West is out to corner your industries. They are using tariffs to block you away from their markets to build their EVs. Understand what the EU is trying to do. They are using the tariffs to force Chinese car makers to move production to Europe. And why is that? The objective is to learn from Chinese technology to level the playing field. Brands like Volkswagen are so far behind the curve that they need to learn from BYD and NIO, for example, to compete. It used to be Beijing demanding Western companies to set up joint ventures to set up shops in China, right? But it's the exact opposite happening right now. The Chinese government can see this coming a mile away. China dominates the entire EV sector, and the EU is trying to force a technology transfer. But this is not going to work. Beijing is moving to ring-fence its entire R&D. China is telling their automakers to keep their EV technology in the country, in-house. And that means producing the key parts like batteries and motors locally. Companies like BYD and Chery are encouraged to just send knockdown kits to their foreign plants for final assembly. So all the factories in Europe could be just hollow shells that put the parts together. And if that's the case, the EU market simply becomes a math equation for Chinese automakers. Do the tariffs make enough sense to manufacture in China and then ship out to Europe? Or do we just make an assembly plant in Germany or Spain? We'll ship the body kits and components over to put them together. And if that's the case, China can still enter the EU market without giving up the secret sauce. But if the economics don't make sense, China could simply manufacture back home. And whatever shortfall they lose from Europe, they will simply focus on other growing markets. Firstly, the EV market in Europe is starting to contract. Demand in Germany, for example, has been collapsing since the start of the year. In August alone, EV registrations fell by nearly 70%. So, China is being punished for entering a market whose demand is declining fast. People in Europe don't have the money to even buy affordable EVs from China. The German government themselves can't afford to give further subsidies. Does it even make sense to commit to a factory in Europe? And if Chinese companies pull away their plans for EV plants, the entire supply chain gets affected as well. Beijing can always retaliate. S-Volt and CATL are Chinese battery makers in Germany, and they are halting growth plans because EV sales are falling. The new tariffs will make cars more expensive in Europe, and the demand for batteries there will collapse. And this, ironically, will bleed EV technology away from Europe. It will be a major setback for German brands like Volkswagen, which is looking to up their game. And here's how important batteries are to the EV supply chain. Take the ID.4 car from Volkswagen, the 2023 model. It retails for around $37,000. However, look at how much the battery alone costs. Almost $9,000. That's over 23% of the entire car's value, almost a quarter. And the batteries for the car come from CATL, the world's biggest battery maker. So just imagine if the company stops its spending or pulls its operations away from Germany. The cost of the biggest EV component will fly up through the roof. China controls the entire supply chain for batteries. If the EU is forced to build its own, it's game over for the EV industry. It will take decades, and it will take a ton of money to replicate, and there's no guarantee they will succeed. If the EU wants to build self-reliance just on batteries, it will cost them at least $98 billion. Countries like Germany will have to build the refining facilities from scratch, and those are just the initial construction costs. Let's not forget the operating costs involved. China already has raw material contracts with suppliers of lithium, nickel, and cobalt around the world. And in China, energy costs are also much lower. Even if the EU builds its facilities, China can just flood the world with cheap batteries. It will make production unprofitable. Chinese companies could force EU battery plants to shut down, and this is how nasty the economic war can evolve. But it looks like we are headed on this sad trajectory towards protectionism. The trade barriers are going to get higher and higher, and the biggest loser here will be the EU consumer. They'll be forced to buy more expensive EVs. Imports from China will now cost more. Local EU brands will also jack prices up because they simply can. But let's pivot a bit to the Middle East because things are getting from bad to worse over there. A few days ago, Iran launched their missiles at Israel. And Israel, they have vowed retaliation. The big question is, what kind of payback is coming? Because even the US is in panic mode. Biden at first told the world that the US is thinking of supporting Israeli strikes on Iran's oil facilities, and this is dangerous on so many levels. Citibank says that a strike there could take out 1.5 billion barrels a day of production, which is a very significant volume. And if all crude at $80 was bad, this could spike oil to three figures very easily. However, in less than a day, President Biden, well, he did a 180. It's as if someone told him, his handlers told him, that this would be a very, very bad idea. Here's how severe the strikes can get. If we look at the map, we can see that Iranian oil facilities are so tightly grouped that a chain reaction could occur. Iran has a refinery that processes nearly 500,000 barrels of crude. It is next to their biggest terminal that handles up to 28 million barrels. Oh, but it gets worse. You see that green dot there? That's the Bushehr nuclear plant. So now there's a risk of a meltdown as well. If Israel hits the oil field, so many things could go wrong. A ton of Iranian oil could get cut off, which could send oil prices flying up. The Chinese won't be exactly happy either. They are the biggest importer of crude from Iran. Let's not forget that. Remember that the strikes don't have to come this week or next month. The US and Israel can always choose when to retaliate. And even if Trump gets into office, retaliation is still on the menu. He even hinted that Iran's nuclear facilities might be fair game. They asked him, "What do you think about Iran? Would you hit Iran?" And he goes, "As long as they don't hit the nuclear stuff. That's the thing you want to hit, right?" I said, "I think he's got that one wrong. Is that what you're supposed to hit? I mean, it's the biggest risk we have. We have to be prepared. We have to be prepared." But when they asked him that question, the answer should have been to hit the nuclear first and worry about the rest later. And here's how explosive the situation can get. The entire region is filled with Iranian-linked proxies, with the Houthis from Yemen and Hezbollah up north. They're all surrounding other oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. And if things escalate, there's no guarantee that the chaos won't spread. Then we'll have an oil crisis on our hands. And if you think cutting away Iranian oil was bad, just imagine if Saudi crude gets disrupted. We'll see Brent fly above $100 in a day. According to Reuters, the Gulf states are scrambling to stabilize the situation. They're telling Iran that, "Hey, we are neutral in this, and don't drag us into it," which, needless to say, is very, very concerning. It seems that the Iranians are hinting they might strike oil facilities in the region. It could be part of their backlash. In 2019, a key refinery in Saudi Arabia was attacked by drones and cruise missiles, and it took out around 5% of the global oil supply for days and caused the price of Brent to spike up. So there is some precedent for attacks on energy infrastructure in the Middle East. It's not impossible here. So the situation is extremely tense. If oil suddenly spikes up again, this narrative of a soft landing could suddenly reverse. Higher inflation could cause the Federal Reserve to pause its rate hikes, and that alone can cause this overvalued market to collapse. Why do you think Biden doesn't want to strike? Because it would destroy the Harris campaign. Hitting Iran's oil fields would be a disaster. Now, let's assume Iranian oil gets taken out, and it spreads to other oil producers in the Middle East. Just between Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and the UAE, we have nearly 20 million barrels of production a day. If that gets compromised, everything from crude to oil products will get smashed down. To no one's surprise, the most vulnerable will be the EU. Ever since the war, Russian flows have dropped to nearly zero. How do you think Europe is making up for the shortfall? They are buying from the Gulf countries, including Iraq. Nearly 1 million barrels flow from the Middle East to the Eurozone. If that is cut off, there's no way the EU can replace those volumes with cheap oil. The US itself is sufficient, while China can easily get affordable oil from Russia. So, this crisis will smash Europe's economies even more. They'll be forced to import more expensive energy, maybe more LNG from the US, and I don't think America is going to give them a discount here. If we couple this with the EV trade war with China, you can easily see why the EU is cornered. They just made the situation even worse. So if the Middle East crisis escalates, we can expect Europe's economies to just circle the toilet. But let me know what you think. Did the EU make a horrible mistake with their tariffs? And will Iran's oil fields get taken out? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, and be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.